Okay, today let's talk about the blood supply of the eye. As we all know, the blood supply of the eye mainly comprises of three kinds of arteries, which is the central retinal artery, the posterior ciliary arteries, and the anterior ciliary artery. So today, we are going to talk about these three kinds of arteries separately and talk about what kind of eye structures do they nourish. So first, let's look at the central retinal artery. The central retinal artery, it enters the optic nerve about 1 centimeter behind the optic disc, probably from here. So it penetrates the optic nerve and it goes forward and branches out at the optic disc. The four branches are the superior and inferior temporal retinal arteries and the superior and inferior nasal retinal arteries. You can see them not in this horizontal section of the eye, but in the fundus of the eye. These four branches from the central retinal artery nourish the inner 5 layers of the retina. They penetrate the retina and goes in between the retinal cells, directly nourishing the retinal cells. This is the central retinal artery. Then, let's look at the second one, the posterior ciliary arteries. Let's first look at the short posterior ciliary arteries, which are these two branches. They supply blood to the choroid. This is the choroid. The short posterior ciliary arteries, they create these little loops here called the chorial capillaries. The chorial capillaries, as you can see in this picture, they remain inside the choroid and they do not branch into the retina like the central retinal artery do. Instead, they diffuse oxygen and nutrition into the intercellular space and then into the retinal cells, and also the metabolic wastes from the retinal cells diffuse into the intercellular space and then back into the chorial capillaries. In this way, the short posterior ciliary arteries can nourish the outer 5 layers of the retina. The third one is the long posterior ciliary artery. You can see that, unlike the short posterior ciliary arteries, which form these little loops called the chorial capillaries and supply blood to the choroid, the long posterior ciliary artery penetrates the sclera and goes in between the sclera and the choroid and ends up here. It creates an anastomos with the anterior ciliary artery here. These two arteries, which are the long posterior ciliary artery and the anterior ciliary artery, they together nourish the iris and the ciliary body. So the long posterior ciliary artery and the short and the anterior ciliary artery, they create anastomos here and nourish the iris and the ciliary body. Okay, so let's do a quick review. What are the three kinds of arteries that supply blood to the eye? They are the central retinal artery, the posterior ciliary arteries, which comprise of the short posterior ciliary arteries and the long posterior ciliary artery, and the anterior ciliary artery. The central retinal artery supplies blood to the inner 5 layers of the retina by branching into the retina and going directly in between the retinal cells, while the short posterior ciliary arteries, they form these little loops called the chorial capillaries and supply blood to the choroid, and the nutrients from the chorial capillaries diffuse into the intercellular space and into the retinal cells, while the metabolic wastes from the retinal cells diffuse into the intercellular space and back into the chorial capillaries, and thus the short posterior ciliary arteries nourish the outer 5 layers of the retina. And at last, the long posterior ciliary artery, it goes in between the sclera and the choroid, and it creates anastomos with the anterior ciliary artery and together they nourish the iris and the cerebral body. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you.